I always thought cheating was a choice. A deliberate act. A moment where you knew exactly what you were doing and crossed the line anyway. But when his eyes lingered on me for just a second too long, I realized that sometimes it happens before you even know it. The dining room was filled with warmth, low lights, the rich scent of grilled steak, soft jazz humming from the speaker in the corner. It was one of those nights that should have felt comfortable, familiar. My husband sat across from me, laughing, his hand wrapped around a glass of bourbon, telling a story he'd probably told a dozen times before. I smiled at the right moments, nodded when expected, but my mind wasn't on the conversation. It was on him. The man sitting just 2 seats away. He was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest. I told myself I was imagining it. That the flicker of something in his eyes was a trick of the candlelight. That the quickening of my pulse was just the wine warming my blood. Trick of the candlelight. That the quickening of my pulse was just the wine warming my blood. But the longer the night stretched on, the more I caught myself glancing in his direction. And the more I wondered if he was doing the same. He was supposed to stay for a week, maybe 2, just until he figured things out. That's what my husband said when he brought his bags through the front door, dropping them in the spare room like it was no big deal. And at first it wasn't. The routine barely changed. Mornings started the same, evenings ended the same, but somewhere in between something started shifting. It was subtle at first. A glance held a second longer than necessary. A touch so brief it could have been accidental. The way he stood too close when reaching for a plate, or how his eyes lingered when I laughed. It was nothing, but it was everything. Then one night my husband got caught up at work, leaving just the 2 of us. The air between us felt different, heavier. Conversation wandered, effortless, until suddenly his voice dropped just enough to make my breath hitch. "Are you happy?" The question hit harder than it should have. I scoffed, shook my head, gave some dismissive answer. But long after he walked away it stayed with me. Because the truth was, I didn't know. The air smelled like fresh paint, sharp and clean, as I reached up to roll another coat onto the wall. He was beside me, fixing something near the baseboard, sleeves pushed up, forearms tense with focus. It was nothing. Just another moment in a long string of moments, until I shifted my stance, lost balance for half a second, and his hand shot out to steady me. His fingers wrapped around my wrist, warm, firm, grounding. I should have pulled away. Instead I looked at him, really looked, and everything changed. His breath was shallow, lips parted just slightly, eyes locked onto mine like he saw something I wasn't ready to admit. The silence stretched, too thick, too loud. And then, before I could think, before I could stop it, his mouth was on mine. It was quick, too quick, but the damage was done. We broke apart, eyes wide, breathless, the weight of what just happened pressing down like a storm about to break. I turned away first, gripping the paint roller, pretending. He cleared his throat, stepped back. Neither of us spoke, but the air between us would never be the same. It was a mistake. That's what I told myself. A lapse in judgment, a fleeting moment that meant nothing, that could be erased if I just ignored it long enough. So I did. I avoided his eyes, kept my distance, pretended my heart didn't race every time he walked into the room. But he wasn't making it easy. He was different now. More present, more attuned to me in ways I wished he wasn't. His glances lingered longer, his presence felt closer, his words carried an undertone I couldn't ignore. He didn't press, didn't say anything out of line, but every movement, every breath, was a reminder of what had happened, of what could happen again. I should have told my husband, confessed the kiss, let him anchor me back to reality. But he didn't notice. Not the way I hesitated before answering, not the way my voice wavered when I laughed at his jokes. He was oblivious, lost in his own world, trusting, blind. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that made me angry. Because if he really knew me, if he really paid attention, wouldn't he have seen it? Wouldn't he have felt it? I kissed him first. I didn't think, didn't hesitate, just reached for my husband like I was drowning and he was the only thing keeping me afloat. He responded instantly, pulling me closer, warm, familiar, safe. I told myself this was what I needed, what I wanted. If I could just remind myself of who I was, of the life I had built, everything else would fade. But it didn't. My hands moved on instinct, my body followed muscle memory, but my mind was somewhere else. The way he touched me, it was different. Not bad, not wrong, just different. I shouldn't have noticed, shouldn't have cared, but the thoughts crept in anyway. Would the other one hesitate like this? Would he move slower, faster? Would he say my name the same way? I bit down on my lip, forcing myself back, forcing myself to feel something real, but it was no use. My husband held me close, unaware, content, and I let him, pretending I wasn't falling apart. But as his hand ran down my spine, all I could think was one simple, crushing truth. I was lying. And I had never been good at lying. He wasn't hiding it anymore. The way he lingered when we were alone, the way his shoulder brushed mine in passing, the way his voice dipped just enough to make my breath catch. It was deliberate now, calculated, like he knew I wouldn't pull away. And he was right. I should have drawn a line, shut the door, walked away. But every time I tried, I hesitated just a second too long. It wasn't just him. It was me. The excuses I told myself were running thin. I wasn't imagining it. This was real, tangible, alive in a way that scared me. And my husband? He still saw nothing. He kissed me goodbye in the mornings, held my hand in the evenings, completely unaware that I was slipping away. The guilt should have been unbearable. Instead, it only made me reckless. I had two choices: stop this before it went too far or let myself drown. The logical answer was obvious. The right answer was clear. But when he looked at me like that, like he already knew what I would choose, I felt my resolve crack. And deep down I knew I wasn't going to stop. The door clicked shut and I listened as my husband's car pulled out of the driveway. I told myself I would stay in the kitchen, keep the conversation light, act normal. But normal didn't exist anymore. He leaned against the counter, eyes locked on mine, amusement flickering across his face like he knew exactly what I was thinking. Maybe he did. I poured a glass of wine with steady hands, pretending the air between us wasn't thick enough to choke on. He didn't move closer, didn't need to. The space between us had already disappeared. "You keep looking at me like that," he said, voice low, teasing like this was all a game. Maybe to him it was. But I wasn't playing anymore. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, left the room. Instead I held his gaze, waiting. Daring. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was loud, filled with everything we weren't saying. He took a slow step forward. I didn't move. He took another. I still didn't move. And just like that I knew. There was no going back. I wasn't going to stop him. Because I didn't want to. She had been struggling with the jar lid for a while, her hands slipping despite her best efforts. Determined to open it without asking for help, she gritted her teeth and kept twisting. Just then he walked in, catching her in the middle of her battle with the stubborn jar of homemade jam. He chuckled, stepping closer, reaching out without a word. His fingers brushed over hers as he took it from her hands, his grip firm, the space between them disappearing in an instant. She should have stepped back. He didn't. He twisted the lid, frowning when it didn't budge, his breath warm against her skin as he muttered, "It's too tight for my big hands to get a good grip." The words didn't matter. The moment did. The way he stood so close. The way she didn't pull away. Then the sound of the door unlocking. It swung open before she could move, before either of them could pretend. Her husband stood in the doorway, eyes flicking between them, face unreadable. The air turned suffocating, the weight of silence pressing down hard. No yelling. No accusations. Just the undeniable truth settling into place. He knew. He didn't say a word. He didn't yell, didn't demand an explanation, didn't ask the questions she wasn't ready to answer. He just stood there, staring, eyes dark, expression hollow. Then without hesitation he turned around and walked away. No anger. No accusations. Just silence. And somehow that was worse. She felt it like a punch to the gut, the weight of what she had done settling into her bones, pressing down until she couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth, desperate to call him back, to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Her throat tightened, her pulse pounded, her hands trembled at her sides. Footsteps faded down the hall, the front door creaked open, then shut. Gone. Just like that. She inhaled sharply, but the air didn't reach her lungs. She had expected a fight, expected rage, expected him to demand why. Instead he had left her standing there, alone in the wreckage she had created. She turned, locking eyes with the man beside her, but even he looked shaken. Because now there was no undoing this. No pretending. No escape. She had lost everything. And she had no one to blame but herself. The house was silent. Too silent. No laughter, no footsteps, no distant hum of a conversation in the next room. Just emptiness. She sat on the couch, staring at nothing, the weight of it all pressing down on her chest like a hand squeezing the air from her lungs. She checked her phone for the 100th time. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, no explanations. He was gone. They were both gone. Her husband hadn't come back. The other one hadn't stayed. She had destroyed everything, and now she was left to sit in the ruins alone. The wineglass on the table was still half full from earlier, the evening frozen in time mocking her. She reached for it, but her hands were shaking, so she let it be. The weight of what she had done settled in deep, an ache in her bones, a pit in her stomach. She thought the worst part of this would be getting caught, but she was wrong. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, the guilt, or even the shame. The worst part was being left behind. Because now she wasn't just unfaithful. She was nothing.